overall, in terms of the president's personal approval rating, it's always been relatively consistent. If there are challenges, it's not his fault, it's everybody else's fault. So I think the strong personal trust and belief of the Indonesian public remains fairly consistent. But I think the issue is whether or not the sources of information that the Indonesian public got throughout the pandemic, I think that also shapes how we look at the world.
So has there been a sort of censorship or a management of the information Indonesians have been receiving since Joko Widodo has been in office?
Well, I think in terms of the pandemic in particular, it's certainly much more chaotic in the first year or so. But I think now the information has been a lot more consistent and systematic. We can disagree about the contents of those messaging, but the style of communication over the pandemic management has certainly improved over the past year or so. And in our poll, we showed that actually most Indonesians still see authority figures like the president, like the military, like the police as their most trusted sources of information rather than traditional mainstream media or even news, online news. So I think the sense of authority, as in the source, seems to be more important for Indonesians rather than the medium itself.
Yeah. In contrast, the Indonesians are far less trusting of global powers. What's been driving that?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that Indonesia in general never really fully trusts all great powers, whether it's China, the United States, or others. But the decline, I think, over the past decade is certainly much more consistent with a more inward-looking outlook among many Indonesians, while at the same time becoming more self-confident in how we navigate the world. So to some extent, this potentially could be contradictory, but in reality, it also tells us the sources of information about the outside world is very much more limited. Very few Indonesians actually follow international events very closely. Very few actually travel abroad. So the lack of international exposure can help explain why, on the one hand, we see a decline in trust over regional countries and major powers, but at the same time becoming more self-confident in Indonesia's ability to navigate the world.
Yeah. You know, it was fascinating at a time when Australia has been trying to deepen its relationship with Indonesia, a very significant drop-off in the way they view Australia and in particular the Prime Minister Scott Morrison.
Yeah, I think with Australia, you have to look at that particular issue about trust regarding the Prime Minister across a range of different questions as well, because we asked a few different questions about Australia, whether it's about signature foreign policy tools like the Quad, warmth feeling or thermometer feelings, and a range of others. And actually, to be honest, if you look at these questions as a whole rather than the individual ones, actually, Australia's standing is not particularly horrible. I think it's not the best, but it's not the worst, certainly. It's certainly above average, I would say, over the past decade. And I think it depends on a particular issue area as well. But
so
overall,
what areas do you feel we need, is there room to grow and strengthen for us in our relationship?
If you look at some of the more specific questions, for example, whether or not Australia is seen as carrying the water for the United States, whether or not Australia is seen as interfering in Indonesia's domestic affairs or over Papua, these are always the kinds of questions that Indonesians are most worried about. But in general, most Indonesians do not see Australia as a threat as opposed to, for example, China. So in that sense, Australia is not seen as threatening. Yes, there are always lingering concerns about Australia's sort of more activist foreign policy issues like Papua, or considered as interfering in Indonesia's affairs. But this has not kind of put Australia on the same category as a threatening state like China. So in that sense, I think Australia is doing fairly well.
So I do want to talk a bit more about China and why it has emerged as pretty much the #1 security threat for Indonesians.
Yeah, I think what we have seen over the past decade, if you look at the series of questions collectively, compared to the US, for example, we asked about 16 different questions from hard power indicators like military capabilities, domestic influence, economic leadership, all the way down to where you want to study and work. Across all of these different questions, yes, trust in all of major countries are down, but China seems to be declining worse compared to the US. Of all these 16 questions, about 12 or 13, the US is actually leading by a small margin in some, but it's certainly leading compared to China. So China's perception, I think, has declined across the board, even in areas traditionally seen as a Chinese stronghold, like foreign investment. Very few now favor Chinese investment compared to Saudi Arabia, for example. So in that sense, I think that's a key trend. A second key trend is what we have seen over the past few years, China's increasingly aggressive and escalatory behavior in Indonesia's maritime domain, in the North Natuna Sea in particular, I think has contributed to that decline. And of course, the way Indonesian domestic political elites have presented the influx of Chinese workers into Indonesia has certainly not helped the case.
Yeah, so there is a real sense of direct threat on home soil.
I wouldn't call it a direct threat in terms of military aggression as such, but
Like
it is certainly seen, in the sense of how China might undermine Indonesia's interests, but as well as potentially interfering in Indonesia's domestic affairs, whether it's through economic influence or whether it's through something else. But the sense of domestic vulnerability from Chinese behavior and potential influence is certainly there.
Good to talk, Evan. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for your time.